Today's guest is experimental physicist Phil Moriarty. Phil's based at the University of Nottingham and works at the smallest of scientific coalfaces, manipulating individual atoms in microscopes that, well, they're probably unlike any microscope you've ever seen. Now, I've been making videos with Phil for something like 10 years, mainly on my physics channel 60 Symbols, but Phil has contributed to a smattering of Numberphile videos, perhaps most memorably a heavy metal song about the golden ratio. Anyone who's seen Phil's videos will know he's got a strong Irish accent, so I started by asking him, well, a little bit about that.
I was born in London in 1968 in Ealing and moved to Ireland. Parents moved to Ireland when I was 4.
Were your parents Irish?
My mother is Irish. My dad was a Geordie.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So that's someone from Newcastle, for people who don't know what a Geordie is.
And he maintained that accent the whole time he was in Ireland, to the point where I had friends, if they were there, that said, don't leave me alone in a room with him. I can't understand a word he says.
It's interesting because I've always thought of you as this like super Irish guy, like, you know, cut you and you'd bleed green, but you're not Irish to the core.
I'm not, and actually I grew up right at the border during the 80s, late 70s, 80s. You know, very strongly nationalistic fervour, very close to a place called Grossmaglen that got bombed every 10 days or so, and that pushed me really back against, you know, sort of nationalism and patriotism, etc. So do I feel Irish? Well, I've got this accent, you know, as part of my culture, but so too is, you know, favourite writer is Douglas Adams, British. Favourite band is Rush, Canadian. Do I feel, you know, incredibly connected to Irish culture? You know, I love Thin Lizzy, an Irish band. I hate uilleann pipes and I hate Gaelic football and Gaelic sports. So, yeah, it's I've never felt particularly patriotic, I've got to admit.
Do you know, in all the years I've known you and all the conversations we've had, I guess we've never talked about this because I always thought of you as a guy who was really like Irish and like, you know, felt like an Irishman in England and up the English and stuff, but you're like, no.
Well, you know, there is that. You know, there is some aspects of that. I do remember some feedback from students. One particular comment in the first set of lectures I gave in the module questionnaire came back, how would you improve this lecture? How would you improve this lecture module? Make the lecturer less Irish. So, and also, as we were just discussing before you started recording, Brady, the tree thing, I got hit by that, the dirty tree and a turd thing over and over again. So the accent is part of, you know, do I feel very, very Irish? I feel more Irish than British, certainly, but you know, I'm not particularly nationalistic or patriotic.
What were you like as a kid? Were you nerdy? Were you into maths and physics and...
Very nerdy. Hugely into science fiction. Star Trek, Star Wars. Favourite comic was something called 2000 AD, which I hope some people still remember. Home of Judge Dredd. Into astronomy, into NASA. I remember, I think I've told you this story before, Brady, but writing off to NASA around about the time of the Voyager probes when I was 10. And a 10-year-old scroll on it's not much better now, my writing, which was, Dear Sirs, I really enjoyed the Voyager probe. Could you please send me some photos? And sent it off and forgot all about it. And then 3 months later, in the heart of rural Ireland, this big envelope stuffed full of photos with a letter to Mr. Moriarty arrived. And I was like, oh, wow. And so that was amazing. So thank you, NASA. That was a big influence. In the end, I didn't go down the sort of astronomy route. I went down got a microscope for Christmas at one point, and that pushed me in the other direction, to smaller things rather than bigger things.
So if I'd gone to you as a little kid and said, Philip, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would the answer have been?
So it depends on what age, but at age 8 or 9, probably an astronaut. At anywhere from about 10 or 11 onwards, probably a scientist. And even though I didn't have a really good conception of what that actually meant, scientist. Then further on, when I found guitar, rock star, that didn't work out, and then back to being a scientist again. Yeah.
What were you like at mathematics? This is Numberphile, so I always like to ask people about their relationship with mathematics.
Okay, for a physicist, this is a very guilty confession. I'm a really poor mathematician. I did not do well in maths courses. I have to think really, really hard. So I banged on in so many 60 Symbols videos about my favourite aspect of maths, which is Fourier analysis and transforms. And I love maths, but insofar as anything comes naturally, It certainly doesn't come naturally to me. What did come a lot more naturally was coding. And I spent a lot of time during my degree. My mantra was, can I code this? Because if I can't code this, in other words, if I can't see an algorithm to translate the maths into something I put on a computer, I don't understand the maths. So that really, really helped. So
keeping you as a kid though, because I want to deal with you as a child first. I'm assuming, because you're slightly older than me. I'm assuming there wasn't loads of coding at school for you.
Yeah, so the very first computer I got was a ZX81 in 1981, a Sinclair ZX81, and that was 1K of RAM. And you talk about nerdy kid. So another really influential event was when I wrote some code for the ZX81 and sent it off to a computing magazine, and they published it, and I got, I don't know, 30. It was actually quite a lot of money for. It was probably £2 or something, but I remember it was 30 quid, like a big sum of money. When I was...
What did you code? What was it? Though?
So it was like a couple of games, a few games, and it was the listings. So you type these into the, and it was, I just sent over a listing. So it was like a space game where basically you had a V, like literally the character V.
Yeah.
Moving through a field of asteroids, and the asteroids were asterixes, and you had to dodge back and forth with the keys and just get through to the sort of boss thing at the end. Which on 1K was that. Now that was a challenge, a real challenge, coding anything in 1K. But it was so much fun. Yeah, and that's really so. It was the combination of, as we've discussed before in one of the 60 Symbols videos, the whole radio thing, and my uncle was a radio amateur, and he and I played around with a lot of circuits and built crystal radios and stuff, coupled with a couple of years later on, so 81, I was 13. And so it was the combination of always an interest in circuits and electricity, and then when computing came in, I just got absolutely hooked on computing. Wrote the world's, not in the ZX81 but in the ZX Spectrum, wrote the world's stupidest Pac-Man game with the stupidest ghosts that just basically went to a corner and stuff.
Was Pac-Man a V as well? Or?
No, Pac-Man, this was ZX Spectrum, so we actually had, I can't remember, 16 colours or something at that point, 256 colours possibly. No, it was a little bit better than that. It was still pretty awful.
We have to find that space game and resurrect it for Numberphile.
That's a good idea. If we can, I have no idea how to go about it. I can't even remember. I'll talk to my mum. She might well have kept it somewhere. Yeah, she might have.
That would be amazing. Another story from your younger days that I always love hearing. I don't know if we've told it on a podcast yet or in a video, but about the you and the communion wafer. This shows that you were destined to be a scientist to me.
Yes. So I was brought up in an intensely Catholic environment, mass many times a week, Catholic primary school, didn't see the outside of the church all of Easter, just spent the time in there. And one of the classes, we were discussing the wonderful aspect of Catholic doctrine known as transubstantiation, which is where the host in the communion, the piece of bread, is meant to actually become the body of Christ. So this was just after I got that microscope for Christmas. I don't know, it was 9 or 10, I can't quite remember. And I got very excited, stuck my hand up in class, and, whoa, we can do this really great experiment. We can look at the host beforehand with the microscope. I've got a microscope. And then we can look at it after we do all the Eucharist and the Holy Communion thing, and then we can see the difference, and we can see it converted from the bread into the body of Christ. And I got sent out of the class, and I got sent to the priest for added instruction, and got told those were not the type of questions you should ask. So me and religion started to part ways around about that point in time.
I hope you remember that feeling next time I ask you a question during an interview and you say,
no, I'm not going there.
I don't.
That's purely from ignorance, yes.
So as you got to the end of high school, you obviously had made firm decisions about what you wanted to do at university. What did you choose to do at university?
So physics, and I actually did an applied physics degree. I went to Dublin City University. I was not a great student, which possibly we can get to, but did applied physics. And the reason I went there rather than other universities is that the open day was phenomenal, and they had lots of, fiber optic stuff and robotics, and I was just in my element, loved it. And went there, did reasonably well in first year, not so well in second year because the music thing was starting to interfere with studies, and completely failed my third year.
Completely failed?
Mm-hmm.
So what did you do?
Right, so I repeated my third year, and I tell that story to tutees now, particularly tutees who've done poorly in exams, and they feel that it's the end of the world, and I felt it was the end of the world at that point. But I know for a fact, if I hadn't have failed those exams, I would not be here now. I would not be doing this job, because I was drifting really badly. If I'd managed to squeeze through third year without failing, I'd have drifted through fourth year. There's no way I'd have got the marks I needed to do a PhD.
What did you do wrong? Were you just going out and drinking and playing in bands.
So don't drink alcohol. So it wasn't that. It was the band thing. So the night, I remember vividly, right before the maths exam, we played a gig in Donegal and got back into the house round about 3 o'clock in the morning, then got up to get a bus to Dublin at 6 o'clock in the morning, had 3 hours sleep. Didn't do so well in that exam, and it was really that I was distracted with other things, plus the fact I'm not a particularly good mathematician either. So,
how important was mathematics through that university period? You were there to do physics, and you said maths, wasn't your passion. What was that relationship like?
Maths is the language of physics, so I just had to knuckle down and get there. And first year I did a reasonably good job, and as I said, it sort of faded off over the next few years. Fourth year I had to put an awful lot of effort in, but it's a question of practice. It's like anything. I don't want to bring up the tired musical instrument example that I use all the time, but if you want to learn something, you practice it and you practice it and you practice it up to the point where you know pain almost. And that's what it was like with maths. The way to learn maths and the way to get any type of mild proficiency even with maths is to just keep doing problems.
I talk to mathematicians more than physicists on this podcast. And, I'll hear them talk about they got to university and for the first time they understood the beauty of a proof and they saw maths in a new light and all this beauty. Do you have that kind of appreciation for mathematics, or for you as a physicist, is it just like a tool, like a screwdriver?
So for me, the real beauty, I do have that appreciation. There are things like, the Mandelbrot set, for example, which is just amazing, this whole mathematical universe. But where I really get excited is where you have the mathematical framework connecting different aspects of the universe around us. It's been described as the unreasonable effectiveness of maths in terms of describing the universe. That's where it really, really hits me. Not so much in proof. There are no proofs in science. So we don't, and things that, when we talk about dx, dt in terms of maths, when we talk about calculus, there are no d's in the real world. Everything's a delta. And so too often I think that distinction between physics and mathematics is lost, and sometimes you can get carried away with the beauty and the elegance of the maths, and sometimes that leads you in the right direction, and sometimes it doesn't lead you in the right direction at all.
Do you ever look at mathematics as a discipline, have an envy for that? Do you look at it and think, oh, that's beautiful and different and it hasn't got that kind of messiness and uncertainty that my experimental physics has, or do you look at it with disdain?
No,
and think,
there's beauty in the messiness. I'm an experimentalist. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool experimental physicist, and, we collaborate with theorists. We even dabble a little bit in theory ourselves, but there is nothing like, when you get a new experimental result, something that possibly nobody else in the world or possibly nothing else in the universe has ever seen before. That's what really sort of gets me out of bed in the morning. And if that connects with theory and you can explain it, wonderful, but it's the discovery aspect, I guess. The explanatory beauty of the mathematics is great, but again, sometimes you can get caught up and you think, well, this theory's got to be right because it's so elegant and so beautiful. And I've been disappointed so many times when you think, we've got it, and then an extra piece of data comes in and something that looked so seamless and so beautiful just comes crumbling down.
But of course, mathematics does have discovery and breakthroughs and frontiers.
It does, of course it does, and proofs are important. I'm not saying proofs are important. Antimatter, for example, and positrons just popped out effectively of solutions of the equations, and mathematics makes predictions and physical theories based on that mathematics makes predictions, but they are predictions and they remain predictions until we can actually get the experimental evidence to support them. And increasingly, in some aspects of physics that will remain nameless, that link between experiment and theory, it's sometimes felt that, well, as long as the maths is self-consistent and as long as the maths is elegant, then that's all we need. And as an experimentalist, no, I can't take that.
Just a quick interlude to thank today's episode sponsor, G Research. This is a world-leading quantitative finance research firm based in Europe. G Research is always looking to hire the brightest people to tackle the big questions in finance and applying all the latest in machine learning and big data, all that cutting-edge stuff. If you're good with numbers or mathematics or computers, well, this could be your big chance. G Research is really focused on creating a great work culture and nurturing future talent. If you'd like to find out more about them and the opportunities there, go to gresearch.co.uk/Numberphile. It's G Research. Create today, Predict tomorrow. Going back to university then, after you kind of righted the ship and redid your third year and got through, at what point did you start seeing a specialisation and where your career was going to go?
So actually, I was planning on going into sound engineering at the end of my fourth year, as you might have guessed. That's really where I've always been interested in music, and I'm interested in signal analysis and waveforms, and hence Fourier analysis, etc. What made the difference is that along with the graduation letter, there was a letter sent out round about June advertising a PhD. Now somebody had been identified for that PhD, but they dropped out at the last minute, and they were contacting all the final year students, and it was on STM, scanning tunneling microscopy, and I was aware of work that had been published very, very recently. It was the first time atoms had been moved around, and to spell out a word, IBM. When I got this letter and I knew it was about STM, I got back in touch very, very quickly and said what was the possibility of actually getting involved with that project, and didn't look back. Within 6 months of starting that, I sort of knew I wanted to be an academic.
So this sounds quite serendipitous, like you just kind of almost like convenient. Did you just do it out of convenience because you wanted a job and an option, or did you see something in STM that made you think, I love it, this is where I want to be?
It was the latter. It was the latter, definitely. It was, wow. I hadn't even really considered doing a PhD. It was the subject matter and the fact that it didn't start off like this, but ultimately it was about using an STM to manipulate atoms, which, given all the way back to when I got that microscope as a kid, that was perfect for me.
Can you tell us what scanning, tunneling, microscoping is all about? What's going on here?
I can. It's a microscope like no other. There are no optics, there are no lenses, there are no mirrors, and conceptually it's actually easier, I think, than easier to understand than a traditional microscope. It's basically a record player. It's like an old style record player. You've got a stylus, except in this case that stylus is atomically sharp, and you move it back and forth across a surface, and you use that to map out the features of the surface. That's it in a nutshell. Now, the tunneling bit comes from quantum tunneling. The tip isn't actually in contact, though we can do that as well, with the surface, and there's a current that flows which is due to quantum mechanics, and you measure and map that, and you use that to map out the surface right down to the atomic level.
So it's sort of almost like having your eyes closed and just rubbing your fingers over something to feel what's there. That's
exactly it. And in fact, there's scanning tunneling microscopy, but there's also its counterpart, which we do more of now, I would say, which is atomic force microscopy, which is exactly that. You're mapping out the forces.
What's the advantage of this kind of microscopy over optical stuff and electron microscopes and things we will have been more familiar with?
The great advantage of the scanning tunneling microscope is the resolution. The resolution is right down to the single atom level. Now, you can achieve that with electron microscopes. What you can't do easily with electron microscopes is actually push those atoms around. So the scanning tunneling microscope, atomic force microscope, they're called scanning probe microscopes as a family of techniques. You can manipulate individual atoms, and actually the state of the art isn't even atomic resolution, it's down at the single chemical bond resolution. In terms of an optical microscope, you just can't get down to that type of resolution because the wavelength of light is too large.
Why do you want to be moving things around?
Also, so the way I sometimes, in inverted commas, sell this is, wouldn't it be neat to do 3D printing with atoms? Wouldn't it be neat to have like a Star Trek replicator where you could dial in a blueprint to make something and then have it constructed from the very atoms sort of all the way up? And we're a long way away from that. But it is ultimately the ultimate limit of 3D printing is the individual atoms.
So it's called microscopy, and I always associate that with looking at things, but this field isn't just about looking at stuff, it's about like building them.
Precisely, yeah. So you can just use it to look at stuff, but you can also use it as a tool. And in fact, the great thing is all you need to do is to switch between those two modes. It's the same instrument, is move the tip a little bit closer. So when you're imaging, you pull the tip back a little bit further from the surface so you don't disturb the surface. If you want to move atoms around, push them, pull them, pick them up, put them down, poke them, then you just move the tip in.
I've seen some of the machinery in your lab, and I've also heard you tell stories and seen you curse and swear at the difficulties you might have. It's a fiddly thing, isn't it? Like it's a bit of an art form.
So I've just spent that's a very timely question, really. I've spent the last 2 weeks on my back underneath what's called an ion pump. One of my colleagues said it sounds like something Han Solo would say. I only wish it was as exciting as the Millennium Falcon. So trying to fix things, getting ultra-high vacuum can be a real challenge. So I haven't even explained why we need ultra-high vacuum. So we're looking at surfaces, we're manipulating atoms. What we don't want is a lot of contamination, and the atmosphere is a big big contaminant. So we have our microscope in what's called an ultra-high vacuum chamber. Pressure in there on a good day is comparable to that you get on the surface of the moon in terms of the level of contaminants. And getting that vacuum and keeping that vacuum can be frustrating.
But also the tips themselves, I imagine are they fragile things, these little pointy tips that are scraping over?
That's a very good point as well. Yeah, the tips are difficult to create sometimes and difficult to maintain. In fact, a major program of work we have at the moment is using machine learning to try and train the instrument to keep the tip in the best possible state. So at the moment, the way it works is you take a piece of wire, you etch that wire, you put it inside, you scan. Most of the time, you're not going to see atoms because just the tip's it's not in a good state. So what do you do then? Well, you sort of tickle the tip with little voltage pulses, you increase the current, you push it into the surface a little bit, you push it into the surface even more, you wiggle it around, anything to get atomic resolution.
So you're just trying to mash it into a lucky shape?
You're basically mashing the rocks together, yeah, and hoping that in the end, you're going to get atomic resolution. Now, once you've got that atomic resolution, you can do very sophisticated things like pick up molecules and use those to control the tip. But again, that molecule can drop off and, the tip can change spontaneously or not so spontaneously. And so at the moment, what happens is somewhere between 30 and 50% of researchers' job is getting that tip in a good state. So there's no reason why a researcher should be doing that, hence machine learning.
In your research and your experimental work, rather than your teaching, what mathematics do you use on a day-to-day basis? What do you need to do?
Oh, okay. So that's a very good question. So as I said, we're experimentalists. So we take that data off, we are fitting that data, and we're comparing it largely to something called density functional theory. But that's very computational. In terms of pen and paper maths, in terms of research, I don't do that. It's not something I do. So there are, we might tweak codes. We'll, Markov chains and Monte Carlo methods. We'll use those, but not in terms of pen and paper maths. It's actually all computing based.
You never sit down and have to use calculus?
In my teaching, yes.
Right.
And now, isn't that interesting that there's a rather big divide between what I actually do on a day-to-day basis and what actually we teach? And for me, I will say it again, and I did a quantum course just last semester. For me, computing is at least as important as mathematics. If it were up to me, I would have computing dominating over the maths in physics courses. I know I can hear my theorist friends screaming in anguish not to do that, but for me, I think the one issue with purely analytical maths is that we lose that messiness, which is a feature of the world around us. So knowing that we have noise, knowing that we don't have infinite resolution, we have deltas rather than Ds, is very, very important, and we lose that sometimes.
So until quite recently, I know you were the admissions tutor here at the University of Nottingham. I wish you could see the look on Phil's face then. It obviously wasn't the easiest job he's ever done. If someone's listening to this and thinking, Phil Moriarty, he's got a cool job, that's a cool life, I'd like to do that, and they're still, say, at school, what would you say to them? How can they get into this kind of world?
So, the traditional route in, well, I'll tell you my route in. My route in was I was not a very good student. That's the first thing. I failed those exams, and I'm not suggesting that failing exams is a good life choice. But then I did a PhD. In my case, the PhD took a little over 3 years. The duration of PhDs can be anywhere from, at least in the UK, from about 3 to 5 years. In the US and elsewhere in Europe, it can be a lot longer than that. So it depends. Then I did a period of postdoctoral research, which is after a PhD, which in my case was 3 years, and then I got a lectureship. So that's the traditional route in. It doesn't always have to be like that, but the traditional route is high school, physics, maths, etc. Undergraduate degree, PhD. Some people then do a master's between the undergraduate degree and the PhD, and then periods of postdoctoral research.
What kind of decisions can they be making now, though, to ease the path?
So if they're interested in doing physics, or I guess for it's a Numberphile audience in terms of doing maths, they really, and depending on what level they are, it's a question of GCSE and A-level choices. They need to be doing the right subjects to ensure. Now, it's not the end of the world if they don't do the right subjects and then say 5 or 6 years down the line they decide they want to go into maths. There are foundation years, there are, for example, Open University, there are other ways back in, but in terms of the traditional route, make good decisions, talk to universities about, and talk to admissions tutors. Come to, I know we can't have open days right at the moment, but hopefully they'll come soon. Talk to the admissions tutors and get good advice about what subjects they should be doing.
A lot of the people listening to this will know you because you've appeared in Numberphile videos. You've also appeared in lots and lots of the 60 symbols videos about physics that I've made with you. Even Computerphile, I know you're in loads of those videos. So what's it like being a popularizer of science on the internet?
It has its good sides and it has its downsides. No, it's amazing. So I've had, I think I forwarded that email and I told him. So that guy that got in touch, who as an undergraduate, actually just starting his first year in high school, got in touch N years ago, something like 8, maybe 9 years ago, got in touch, said that 60 symbols, had inspired him and he wasn't thinking about doing physics, and then he ended up doing physics. And I've kept in contact with him, and he sent me an email just a few weeks ago, and now he's done a PhD and he's thinking about going on to do postdoctoral stuff. It's just amazing to think that you have that type of influence, and that I'm not talking about me personally, I'm talking about the entire channel. That's an amazing part of it. The other side of it is those random emails you get from people who've decided they and they alone know the secrets of the universe, and they're going to tell you about them at interminable length. But I think we both experience that. But it's fun. I enjoy the teaching side of things as much as the research. And I've said this to you before, Brady. You have completely changed the way I teach. The way you ask questions, the way you keep me on my toes, the way you have changed just the way I explain things through this. So this 60 symbols has fed directly into my teaching, and of course into the research as well, in terms of when I now go and do presentations, keeping in mind your journalistic approach to things, I think is sometimes creates tension between us. But that tension's a good tension.
Oh, you often say, like, Phil and I, before we do any recording, have some very passionate discussions. Not arguing, but just like really passionate.
Sometimes arguing.
Sometimes arguing, but in as friends. But many times Phil says, you should be recording this is great. But I'm not sure people are ready for that. But that does lead me to say, you are so passionate, and you're like, you're in a good way, quite a volatile personality. Mm-hmm. How has that tied in with things like social media and comment sections on videos and that? That's not always been a match made in heaven, has it?
No, it hasn't. And I've, for example, you warned me, don't go anywhere near Twitter, Phil. Don't do Twitter. And then I did Twitter, and then I came off Twitter about 18 months later. Bad idea. I do not have the temperament. I'm rather too argumentative for that. The comment sections are interesting. The conventional advice is, and colleagues and students in the group and researchers in the group will say that, comment section of YouTube is just basically the entire condensed collective stupidity of humanity in one easy to locate place. And sometimes that's the case, but on the other hand, some of those comments have actually, again, fed into research and teaching. And they can be frustrating and they can be a good thing. We did this video on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I was at pains to say it's not a measurement problem. Then the first bloody comment that ends up with 600 upvotes or something is, well, this is this. And you realise that actually it's not just a question of putting out the right information. It's a question of, people have biases, people have ideologies. You can have watertight arguments in terms of the science, and you were seeing this in terms of disinformation and misinformation right across the web. Countering that is not just a question of the science. It's a question of how you couch. You say, no, how are they going to listen to? Who is somebody who doesn't take the evidence for climate change seriously? Are they going to believe me, a lefty academic? You have to find some way to nudge them in the right direction, and me shouting at them, or others like me shouting at them, is not going to do it. So social media, I had my fill off, I've got to admit, and I pulled back from social media a number of years ago, and I don't regret coming off Twitter one little bit.
Let me give you a few free swings at some popular issues that I know some of them I think you may have opinions of, some you may not, I don't know, but let me hear what you've got to say about them. Funding of blue sky type science versus practical science that's going to make better iPhones. Because this was something when I first met you, you always seemed to be banging the drum about and arguing with people and putting your foot in it. And I don't hear you talk about it, maybe because you're off social media, but like, how are you feeling about how that's going these days?
There is a part in terms of social media. It's, there was an article in The Guardian just a couple of days ago about this issue in terms of blue skies research and funding for research. It's a perennial issue. the division between what we call blue skies research, which means funding for research that doesn't have a tangible near-term benefit, versus stuff that will generate a product, stuff that will generate, a device or an impact, a real-world impact. The true answer is somewhere between those two extremes. Actually, for mathematicians, it's even more important because, mathematicians, an awful lot of their work is very, very fundamental. Without complex numbers, quantum mechanics, it's absolutely key. Nobody knew in terms of hundreds of years ago and how important complex numbers were going to be for quantum mechanics and quantum cryptography, etc. And there are countless examples. The laser's another one that's brought up with great regularity, in that the guy who did it, Towns, the guy that developed the laser, his head of department said, stop playing with this, it's only ever going to be a physicist's toy, and look where lasers are now. So you can't predict. But on the other hand, it's taxpayers' money. And it's not sometimes the most powerful argument, well, just give us 200 years and something may eventually come out of this. And it's a question of how do you divide up that money and how do you put it into work that is going to have both an academic impact, push the field forward, and impact that has some return for the taxpayer. For me, I would say the government, it's a fairly simple argument. I would say if it's close to market, let the market fund it. If government should not be in the business of doing Toshiba's, funding academics to do Toshiba's work for them effectively. If it's close to market, let the market fund it. The universities should really be about the more fundamental side of that equation.
You're reasonably well funded. I mean, you're managing to keep your group going, and you're quite blue sky. So
No, that's right. No, that's an important point, Brady. I've criticised the research councils quite a bit over the years, but you're absolutely right. The stuff that we do is pretty blue skies.
Do you think they've got the balance right at the moment, or is the balance tilted too far to industry?
We're in a bit of a state of flux, not least in terms of Brexit and stuff. And it's not just the research councils in the UK. It's the broader picture, including things like the European Research Council, that need to be taken into account. But it's I think the balance is about, I hesitate to say this, compared to where we were 10 years ago when I was mouthing off all the time. The thing that really frustrated me back then was there was a very strong push in terms of commercialization and making sure that your work had commercial impact. And all the messages were coming out about real world impact, but real world impact not in terms of what you do, in terms of 60 symbols, which is real world impact as well, and Numberphile, etc., and public engagement, but very much pushing towards the commercialization side of things. That's been rolled back over the years. So I'm a little less grumpy. I'm also 10 years older, so that's probably...
Another thing that academics often get grumpy about is the way that publication works in science, and all the way the money works, and you have to pay to get things published and then pay for access to journals and that. Are you relaxed about that these days?
I'm less relaxed about that. There are so many issues about that, and we could have a whole series of bloody podcasts about that, Brady. But one of the issues, I'll give you an example. I work in nanotechnology. So we have a wonderful journal called the Beilstein Journal of Nanotechnology, which does everything we could ever expect to hope of a journal, in that it's entirely free to publish and it's entirely free to read. The Beilstein Foundation in Germany has immensely deep pockets that allow this to happen. Why don't we publish all our work there? The reason we don't publish all our work there is that the entire scientific reward system in terms of careers is effectively based on the brand name of the journals in which we publish. In that if you publish in the Beilstein Journal versus if you publish in Nature or Science, you're going to make it, your career is going to be a hell of a lot easier to develop than for the Beilstein Journal. I am a hypocrite in that I think we should be publishing in Beilstein, but if I did that and I said, right, we're only ever going to publish in the Beilstein Journal, if I said that to the researchers in the group, I may as well say, you're not going to have a career. So we have to go for those brand name journals as well.
Is it exactly quantified? Is it like 8 points for an article in Nature and 2 points for an article in Beilstein, or is it more kind of subtle and reputational than that? It's
more subtle and reputational. In fact, there's something called DORA, which is, I've forgotten what it stands for, Declaration of Research something. I can't remember what the A stands for, but it's something that an awful lot of universities and publishers have signed up to, which is where you don't use something called the impact factor, which is based on the number of citations. The average paper gets in a certain number of years for a journal. And you shouldn't be using things like impact factors. There's also something called H-index, which relates to the number of citations given. And it's more about looking at the overall quality of the work. But that's very subtle. And I've been in many situations where the CVs for researchers, postdoctoral researchers, or even at lecturer level, and people around the table are looking at these, and one person will say, well, candidate A has got better publications, candidate B. And this is the key point, Brady, without ever reading those publications. The decision is made on the basis of the brand name.
Let me poke you with one more stick. League tables.
Okay.
Tell people what a league table is.
Okay, so league tables are in a range of different, in particular with regard to, you said, Brady, I was admissions tutor. So there are university league tables, and those university league tables are published by newspapers and by magazines like the Times Higher Education, and they have a dramatic influence on the applications for universities. And the problem with them is that they are pseudo-statistical at best and complete and utter nonsense. I'm not allowed to swear, Brady. Nonsense at worst. I was struggling to restrain a word beginning with B there. And the problem is that they are utter nonsense. So I used to try and get this message across all the time to applicants and their parents for when they came here for open days to our courses. And parents would say, well, you've slipped so far in the league table. It's nonsense. We went from 18 one year in one particular league table to 5. What did we do different? We did absolutely nothing different. They changed the sort of metrics by which they set the league table up. Moreover, departments rise and fall on a year-by-year basis, and it sells papers, it sells magazines, but they are nonsense. If you asked, have I sort of mellowed on certain things? I've not mellowed on that. I will never mellow on that. And what really irritates me is when physicists who should know better and mathematicians who should know better take those bloody league tables seriously.
So they're put together, you would argue they're put together quite arbitrarily using unfair metrics?
Those who put them together would argue otherwise. I would say that the metrics, it's how does the quote go? Many things that count cannot be counted. The question is, it's very difficult to quantify so many aspects of a department and then to crystallize that down into a single number. It's ridiculous. We're not football teams. A physics department, a maths department is not a football team, and which rises in the table depending on performance. It doesn't go like that.
All right. Can I ask you a question that's going to make you hate me even more than all of this stuff? Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Desert Island Discs, what 5 albums will you take with you to an island? And you have to answer now without thinking time.
Oh my God.
5 albums.
5 albums. Okay, Rush's Moving Pictures. That's absolutely top. Jellyfish's Belly Button. King's X's Out of the Silent Planet. Metallica's Master of Puppets. And probably a Kate Bush album. Maybe. So many others. That's really tricky. Maybe an Opeth album. Okay, I'll go for Opeth. I'll go for Opeth's Ghost Reveries, which is about as far removed from Kate Bush as you can get.
Would you...
Damn you, Brady.
Would you give up your physics career, expunge every paper you've ever written from the records, and go back in time if it meant you could be a music star?
Oh, what a fucking question. Wow. No, I don't think I would. I don't think I would, because that means giving up sort of my life to this point.
Yeah.
No. There are many other aspects. I enjoy this job, etc. But there are many other aspects of my life to this point. I'm not saying I don't have any regrets. Of course I have regrets, but there are many good things that I would not want to lose.
Our thanks to Professor Moriarty for being on today's show. I'll include some useful links to Phil's work, his writings, and some videos in the notes for this episode. Also thanks to G Research for their support and the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute in Berkeley, California. Again, see the notes for some useful links. I'm Brady Harron, and you've been listening to the Numberphile podcast.